The legacy of Xenosaga will have massive spoilers for the entire Xenosaga Trilogy. After the release of Episode 1, Monolith Soft re-evaluated their stance on the series. Takahashi in particular felt that the company should give more meaningful experience to the development staff and step down to a support role. He also felt that his more direct involvement resulted in projects taking much longer than they should. The role of director was instead given to Ko Arai, while lead producer went to Tomohiro Hagiwara, two developers who had more minor roles on Episode 1. With the change in personnel, Episode 2 was intentionally designed as part of an evolving series rather than a static one, with additional mechanics and adjustments made to the story. After 2 years of development, Episode 2 released in 2004, later coming west in 2005. The game begins 14 years in the past, with the Miltian conflict mentioned in Episode 1, where Chaos and a new character called Kanan go down to the surface to find any surviving URTVs, and find the Y data for good measure. One thing you'll notice immediately is that we can now use mechs, called in this game ES units, to traverse the world in certain segments, which is actually a welcome change. It aids massively in the dungeon design later on, which we'll be touching on soon. We use the ES Asher to push through the ruins until we're forced to dock. Here they meet Shion's older brother Jin Uzuki, who has stolen the Y data from Utic. A bit further on, and the three encounter Margulis, who is beaten by Jin in a anime battle. Kanan is given the Y data, and the flashback ends abruptly, showing that the whole sequence was merely a memory of Kanan. Turns out that because Kanan's memory is incomplete, they are not able to fully decipher its meaning. At the same time, Margulis is shown conversing with a mysterious figure known as the Patriarch, where they mention Albedo will act as the key to Old Miltia. At last, we finally rejoin our group from Episode 1 and oh boy, what has happened here? So, the first thing that will hit you like a truck made out of bricks carrying bricks will be the massive shift in art style. Once again, this was a choice by the art director Norihiro Takami, feeling that the stylized approach of Episode 1 wasn't expressive enough. As a result, he decided that the best course of action was to make the character models more realistic, and the finished product was, well, this. Now, I did say that I wasn't a fan of the original designs, they felt a bit too anime. But this one? It's like they took that dial and turned it from overdrive into the negatives. And this idea of changing the models to be more expressive, well, I'd argue that Episode 1 was fine in that regard. The actual meaning of scenes was conveyed well for the most part. These more realistic models, on the other hand, don't aid at all in overall expression. And that's not all. You'll notice very quickly that the voice actors have changed in some cases too, and for the most part, they're not as good as Episode 1.
You make it sound like it was all my fault.
Oh, that's not what I meant. Hey, KOS-MOS! Thank goodness you were there. Man, you really saved us.
Thank you very much. I am happy to be of service.
The delivery feels wooden, the inflection is gone, and it's as if the actors at times weren't aware of the context they were meant to deliver the line in. I do find it funny though that despite all of these changes, Ziggy pretty much remained untouched. Confirmation that we are in fact playing the same series. Yes, I wanted a change, but this isn't much better. If I had to choose, I'd stick with Episode 1's. They at least feel stylized and in line with a JRPG. This here is just weird. Shion, KOS-MOS and Alan leave to report in the Vector headquarters while Momo and her posse go to her mother. Unfortunately, Utic hasn't given up on her, and Momo shows off her GTA skills along the highway. Finding themselves in the aqueducts, they're forced to fight their way through the chaos. Not that chaos, like, he is here, but you know what I mean. Now, the combat in Episode 2 is way more varied than Episode 1, with additional mechanics and specific mech-based combat. For one, the boost gauge is now linked to the whole party, and enemies have the same ability. It stacks to a max of 3 and allows you to jump in for a character turn just as it was in Episode 1. One of the big changes though are the zones. Enemies have zones split into A, B or C, and hitting them in the right order will break the opponent's stance. This will allow for air or down statuses and generally increases overall damage dealt. Zones at times, especially for bosses, will also be longer, like BBCC, and thus will require 2 characters to break it in some cases. This is where you will need to use your boost to ensure that you can execute a long enough combo to not only break the enemy, but deal damage after the fact, as dropping the turn will cause the zones to reset. Stocks are the other notable addition, giving characters a pile of actions. These stocks are most effective for a big burst of damage. So for example, break the enemy, down them or air them, then unleash all stock abilities at once, boosting in between to chain a massive combo together. Event slots also make a return, but more are added, like the random event slot. This is also another element that needs to be looked at when in battle, though I'll be honest, I would have preferred if it stuck to the original 3. Now the eggs units from episode 1 are replaced by ES craft as said before, and they gain their own levels during the game. Unlike in the first game though, you cannot call them during battle, instead they get their own sequences separate from the characters. I do like this change personally, as the units in episode 1 were pretty useless later on. The issue with this iteration though is that it feels quite shallow. You only get 2 mechs per fight, and the strategy normally boils down to build up ether points and use special attacks. It's on the right path though. Lastly, characters no longer have individual skills that they learn or can upgrade, rather everyone can now learn everything, with skills split into class roles. What this means is you get lots more options, but the individuality of each member and their specific strengths and weaknesses are lost. And outside of leveling up, this is the only way you can improve your character, because episode 2, for some weird reason, opted against the use of money. There is no currency in episode 2, and no traditional equipment management. You can equip items, but it's not in the way you would think. Every character instead has free equip slots on the status screen, and on here you can equip flat stat increases that you unlock via the skills menu or items you find in the world. Otherwise, the entirety of progression is tied to the skill tree and leveling up. Not really a fan of that. The combat itself though, it does feel good when you figure it out, and reminded me of the battle system from Xenoblade Chronicles 2, which was my favourite in the series with the whole setup and payoff. And I did get enjoyment from episode 2's combat too, at least initially. It does have an issue though. Because the combat is so dependent on the stocks and boosts, normal battles take way too long. To give you an idea, I was playing on an emulator, which allowed me to speed up the gameplay, and even with that, it was taking upwards of 3 minutes just to wipe out a normal crowd of enemies. Straight away, as soon as you get into a fight, you have to build up your stocks to do any meaningful damage, so that's a few turns lost straight away. Then there's often the need to buff, another couple of rounds lost just to prepare. By the time you actually get to attacking, you've likely already spent about a minute or 2 setting things up. And then, once you've killed one enemy, you have to repeat the process for the other enemies too. For me, this system presents a dilemma. My thoughts were that it was great for boss battles, a singular enemy with a large health pool that allowed me to use all of the mechanics to their full potential. In battles against normal enemies though, it becomes a chore because it's so dependent on some key and time-consuming mechanics. I like the idea, but the execution is lacking. The group find a way out with the help of Kanan after taking out these 2 bozos. We then jump back to Shion, who is reunited with an acquaintance at a bar, that being her brother, Jin. She visits his house and also changes threads for good measure. And I must say, what a lovely house, the decor, the tranquility, you really have to admire the craft. F your plants! They make their way to the UMN Control Center, where preparations are underway to analyse Momo in order to retrieve the Y data, where it's also clarified that Momo is modelled after Mizrahi's own daughter, Sakura, who contracted an illness related to her central nervous system. As the analysis takes place though, Albedo manages to gain access to her subconscious via a trap he planted back in episode 1 at the Song of Nephilim. To prevent him accessing the Y data, Momo shatters her own memories and goes unconscious, meaning that the only way to cure her is to dive into her subconscious via the encephalon. Because Momo's subconscious is modelled directly after Sakura's, the party are made aware that they will be experiencing her memories, in particular people she met and was close with. Junior takes the spotlight here, as her treatment was part of the URTV's training as a secondary function of opposing Udu. Before they go in, Junior reminisces further on the events of Old Milsha 14 years back when the URTVs confronted Udu. If he used his power, it could potentially destroy the whole planet, hence why he severed the link. The decision to do so allowed Udu to break free and cause the URTVs to go mad. It's here where Albedo is infused with Udu's waveforms and where he gained a hatred for Junior, who he sees as a traitor. Inside the Encephalon, they experience the first time that Junior, Negredo, who we know as Guinan, and Albedo made contact with Sakura. It also brought back a memory of my own. Throughout this sequence, the relationship between Sakura and Junior in particular becomes clear, and explains why he was so attached to Momo in episode 1. It also gives further background on Albedo. Of the 3 variants, those being Rubido, Negredo and him, he was the only one who was immortal. As such, his descent into madness begun here as a 2-pronged road. On one hand, he couldn't comprehend the preciousness of life since he himself couldn't die, and secondly, he was faced with the reality that Junior and Negredo would leave him one day when they passed on. Which sucks for him, as he was very close to Junior in particular as they were originally conjoined. This here is a great sequence of events, but also demonstrates something else about Xenosaga as a series, in that the role of protagonist shifts from Shion and KOS-MOS and more to the likes of Junior this time around. Junior was definitely going to be given the spotlight eventually, such was his importance in the first game, but it's great to see many of the questions from episode 1 given some answers, like his role as a URTV and why Albedo has such scorn for him. Talking about Albedo, he also has an intriguing backstory of his own, considering how dependent he was on Junior. Quite a tragic tale when you consider the blessing he had as an immortal and that he knew his 2 brothers would eventually die. I like this shifting focus overall. Having the main perspective change as the series goes on makes sense in a saga like this. I also personally feel that the overall story presentation is stronger in episode 2. The scenes just feel more deliberate and hard-hitting in many cases. The scene where Sakura and Junior are having that heart-to-heart, for example, is very well done. I can totally understand from that scene why Junior is so protective of Momo. And I can't help but wonder, and in a way it's a shame, that did they want to shift the protagonist in the 6 separate games to basically put an extended spotlight on each of them? I'm sure some people already know this, but Xenosaga was originally planned to be a collection of 6 games rather than the 3 it eventually became. One reason for this is because of the exceeded budget from episode 1, and as a result it ended a lot earlier than it should have. This change of plans meant that the original storyline was abridged at certain points. It didn't help either that one of the core scenario writers in Soraya Saga left the company around this time too, meaning some plot points were outright lost. We can only theorise how the series would have materialised had the original plan remained, but I can only say that I would have loved to have seen that fully realised. Eventually, the team confronts the trap laid by Albedo. We take out the boss, which was fairly simple, but the event causes Momo to regain consciousness, thus opening the way to the Y data. Albedo, now holding the key to Old Miltia, opens up the abyss, contently disappearing as he's consumed by this data, and Disc 1 ends. Wait, what? Already? Yeah, that's right. Episode 2 is a very short game. Disc 1 took me just around 12 hours to beat, and that's even considering its slower combat. To beat the whole game took just under 26, as crazy as that sounds. For comparison, Episode 1 took me just over 37 to finish, which I'd still consider to be short anyway. It was surprising to be short, but it does make up for this somewhat via its post-game content. There are loads of optional bosses to take down and items to find. Now, I personally didn't get involved in that as I'm not big on post-game content, never have been, but there's at least another 8 hours extra if you choose to do the rest that the game offers. Disc 2 begins with Shion returning to the Damarung and reporting on the events that have happened thus far. Oh yeah, they're out of the Encephalon now. In the meantime, the so-called immigrant fleet makes their move following the reveal of Old Miltia to seize the Zohar, so Helma and the Kukai Foundation along with Vector launch a counter-offensive. A small task team composed of Kanan, Junior and Jin are aboard a newly restored Elsa to land on Old Miltia to get the Zohar themselves. Shion in the meantime encounters Nephilim and Fabronia once again, who both remind her to save Feb's sisters trapped on Old Miltia, so it's time to get off the Damarung, we got work to do. Knowing of a ship that can slip past surveillance, Shion and Alan go down to the hangar to steal it. And you don't know it yet, but this is where you pretty much win the game. This little section here is a perfect grind spot, enemies that die very quickly and give a ton of XP. By the time I was done, I was around level 40, well ahead of where I needed to be, and it also assisted a bunch with skills as well. So Shion, and by extension the other characters, became pretty damn strong from this point. Upon escaping, the duo are caught unaware by a hostile fleet looking to halt their progress. In response, Wilhelm activates KOS-MOS once again to assist Shion. And I am so happy that I am not joking when I retell this scene. Alright, here we go. KOS-MOS turns her pod into a space motorbike, which then turns into a space motorbike mech that destroys the entire fleet. Hell yes. One of the coolest sequences in the game with badass music to boot, a highlight of the game and one of my favourite moments in the entire trilogy. Now since we've mentioned the music, it's probably best to give it a highlight now. In episode 1, silence was golden, and the songs you did get were lacking in scope. In episode 2, the music returns, which is great, but yeah, it's not the greatest if I'm honest. It's not objectively bad, like poor sound quality or anything like that, rather it's just that the music doesn't really fit the overall tone of the game. Granted, I only apply that opinion to the areas, like Second Miltia, which has horrid music if I'm honest. On the other hand, the cutscenes are mostly good, as you've just seen, and there's a reason for that as the responsibility was split between two different composers. Thankfully in the final game, the task of music composition was left to Yuki Kajiura, who had done the compositions for the cutscenes in episode 2, so in other words, the music was fine going forward. But in episode 2, it's a mixed bag. With Shion and Alan safe, they're found by the new Elsa and reunited with the team. Momo has a plan to break through to Old Miltia, which involves flying between the two very noticeable black holes called the Abyss. But before they can do that, they're blocked by a massive space station. The party land on the stronghold to blow it from the inside in order to open the way, and you get to control your ES units here for a fair amount of the dungeon. And this is something that episode 2 does well. There's a good use of the two mediums of traversal, both as the characters and in their mechs. The dungeons are designed in a way that the two modes work in tandem to progress further in. For example, the ES units can open up certain paths that are inaccessible if you didn't have them, and the characters can use lifts that transport the mechs to deeper parts of the dungeon. It was much better to have it this way as compared to episode 1, where they were merely an extra for combat. It felt like you were using all items at your disposal to best these obstacles, and I'm glad that this carried over to the final game. Now as you go through, you'll also notice something else about these dungeons, something that I'm not too hot on. There are so many puzzles! Most of them aren't too taxing on the brain, I'll admit, but when you find those annoying ones, oh boy. Like yeah, I understand, they're just a thing that you find in JRPGs, but even if you consider the ratio of dungeon to puzzles, Xenosaga Episode 2 must be in the red. No joke, every room feels like it has a brain teaser within it. I'll admit that some of them are quite creative, like adjusting water levels and using weights to access platforms, but then you've got stuff like the book puzzle. Fuck the book puzzle. Thankfully, this is only part of a side quest. You're not forced to do this if you really don't want to, but oh my days, I hate stuff like this. And let me tell you, there are more of these, and they get harder the further you go in. No thanks. I at least have to express my gratitude to Monolith Soft for sparing me from that nightmare. Anyway, you take out a few bosses, kick some switches and detonate the joint. This segment also has a countdown of 30 minutes to escape. Lovely, and that's exasperated further when you consider the slow combat. You take out one more boss with the tried and tested method of charge EP and bleh, destroy the station, and the Elsa is rescued by the Durandal in the ensuing explosion. Negredo in the meantime starts to experience something. Back on the Durandal, the team now decide to make their way to Old Miltia where the immigrant fleet have already landed, raising the possibility that they already have retrieved the Zohar. Landing in the ruins of Old Miltia, the team make their way to Labyrinthos, the previous headquarters of Utic, and the building that houses the original Zohar. Along the way, they take out Vanderkam in a comically sized cannon. Who is Vanderkam? This guy. Remember him from episode 1? Now, it seems minor, but this is where I have to bring in my biggest issue with the storytelling in Xenosaga in a whole, in that, for me, it does an awful lot of tell rather than show, in that if you're not paying attention, it's very easy to miss out on a piece of information, because the games have a habit of taking important information and giving it the slightest of nods, when really it should be given much more time to sink in. On one side, you've got an excellent setup and premise. You've got politics, religion, organizations in the shadows, nefarious schemes, great character backgrounds. The setting is intriguing just from looking at the skeleton of the narrative, but the execution around the premise is inconsistent. Having good ingredients alone will not give you a restaurant standard dish. You need a chef who can bring that out. This is no disrespect to Monolith Soft, rather just a recognition of where they were at the time. That being an inexperienced development team, and the willingness of Takahashi to step back for this latest project and merely provide the support. Some parts are done really well, like the flashback with the URTVs, which has a full-on sequence dedicated to showing the backstory of Junior and Momo. It explains all we need to know about their relationship, as well as provides context for the eventual descent into madness of Albedo. Then on the other side you have moments like this with Vanderkam. If you don't remember the name of a character who was in the first 3 hours of episode 1, you're just taking out a faceless dude in a cannon. Maybe this was to save on time and budget, but there are moments where Xenosaga 2 and 3, there's a pretty big example in that one that we'll be touching on, skims over concepts that really should be given more time or aren't sufficiently explained. The same argument applies for the likes of the immigrant fleet that come out of nowhere, and the funding body behind UTIC, which are given only the slightest of nods. Again, maybe this would have been fully realised if the series stuck to its original 6-episode plan. Anyway, as for Vanderkam, how do we beat him? You guessed it, charge up EP and blast him with specials. Inside, they find what appears to be webbing that has linked itself to the structure of the building through...
Nanomachines gone out of control.
Nanomachines, son!
It's not that. It's actually the residue from Udo that has spread its influence after going berserk. Giggity. As the team progresses further in, they find the mainframe of Labyrinthos, which will allow them to analyse the data stored in Canaan from 14 years prior, the data that couldn't be deciphered at the start of the game. The hidden segments of the data confirms Jin's suspicions that Joachim Mizrahi wasn't the instigator of the Miltian War, and was in fact being used by UTIC for his research on the Zohar. With the awakening of Udo at hand, Joachim isolated the entity within the Abyss, sealing it off along with Milsha, effectively saving everyone from disaster and ensuring that no one could use the Zohar's power. He then sealed the secrets of unlocking it once again within Momo as the Y data. In other words, he was a hero. Good for you, Momo. As they reach the Zohar isolation chamber, Margulis appears once again, and I'm so happy right now because we get another anime battle! Once he flees, the group opens the doors and realises the true horror of what has been happening. Febronia's sisters that Shion was tasked with saving are being used as a link to control the Zohar, a role that has robbed them of all individuality and consciousness. With this, Shion is faced with the true words of what Febronia was saying when she was requested to save her sisters. It wasn't to physically take them back, it was simply to put them out of their misery. It's here where the Patriarch appears and reveals himself as the head of KOS-MOS, the true group that exists behind the fronts of UTIC and the immigrant fleet, and that they are the rightful custodians of the Zohar's power and thus the guides of humanity. Well, isn't he full of himself? And if they weren't convinced already, he also has a giant robot called Proto-Omega which fuses with the Zohar. This fusion causes the whole planet to explode in one of the cooler looking FMV cutscenes, giving rise to the Omega system. The group get back to the Durandal and Negredo opens a communication to Junior, who instantly realises he has been possessed by the supposedly dead Dmitry Yuriev, the creator of the URTVs. The Patriarch is betrayed by Margulis at this time and is forced to defend himself aboard the Omega system. So even now, with all these reveals and revelations, there's still plenty of stuff that has been left unanswered. Even though episode 2 answers a lot of questions, it also raises a lot more too, much like what episode 1 did. When one mystery is over, in this case the reveal of KOS-MOS as custodians of the Zohar and the true masterminds behind the old Miltia War, it's replaced with the motivations of Yuriev. What are his plans? What is the role of Udo in all of this? Even if Xenosaga doesn't always hit home on its story in terms of presentation, it at least keeps the player excited for what's round the corner. The team infiltrate the Omega system to stop the threat of the Patriarch, as he now has a weapon that can destroy any part of the universe he chooses due to the power of the Zohar. The Omega system is another EV and group-based dungeon. It's not that long though and didn't overstay its welcome. This final dungeon's a-okay in my book. In here I had to fight a mechanical hentai monster and a literal cathedral, which honestly looks like it would be better suited for an SMT game. Once done, the team confront the Patriarch, who spouts evil, and Albedo reveals he is still alive but gets instantly disintegrated. We say a few more words and the battle begins. Now I'm pretty certain that the fight broke for me here. The first phase is simple enough, just lodge the dude with a bunch of arrows. In the second phase though, Proto Omega is meant to attack, but he never did. So all in all, he wasn't difficult to beat. The Patriarch is killed by the Testaments and Albedo is revived to link with Udu, causing a space-time anomaly. And if you had any doubts that Junior was the protagonist for this game, well, control changes to him solely as he goes into the anomaly and confronts Albedo, who consistently taunts him in battle, might I add. And I must say, he's got some good lines here.
Did you already forget how to rip someone apart? What's wrong? Kill me now! Hurry! Can't you do anything by yourself? Don't disappoint me. Show me what you're made of!
The fight itself, though, you cannot lose. It's more a case of driving home the relationship and ultimate fate of Junior and Albedo, like two sides of the same coin. The red dragon power and the role of a URTV ultimately makes Junior the perfect anti-Udu weapon, thus making him the one person who can grant Albedo's wish, as Albedo has joined with the waveform of Udu. After a few bouts of shooting, he dies. The thing is though, I can't find it in myself to hate Albedo, despite all the messed up stuff he did. He's very much the antithesis of life and revels in the pain of others, but he had a very simple motivation: to have the affection of his brother. This moment here was sort of a full circle moment that I feel is well deserved. He is eventually pulled away by the Kirschfassers in a very religious looking depiction and finally at peace. Or so you think. Junior, on the other hand, realises he has people that he can still protect and returns to the Duranda with the help of Chaos, who clearly has more of a role to play in the future. With that, the anomaly ends and the original Zohar ends up in space, but draws in a massive Gnosis called Abel's Ark that nabs the Zohar before the Durandal can retrieve it. Chaos stands on the deck with Wilhelm nearby, observing the phenomena. The credits roll and seems quite triumphant for some reason. Why? Aren't we all boned with that massive arc taking the Zohar? It feels like an Empire Strikes Back moment where everything is bad. Why are we all smiling? The last scene shows Wilhelm holding an audience with the Testaments, where the new White Testament is introduced as well. Pretty obvious who it is. With that, the screen fades to black and taunts us with a "to be continued." So final thoughts on episode 2. For me, it is the weakest of the 3 games. The combat, while I appreciate its level of mechanics, was just too slow, and ultimately became frustrating by the end due to the over-reliance on boosts and stocks. The art style was a miss, just like episode 1, and the music was a mixed bag. Great in cutscenes, but uninspiring for the overworld. Granted, I really liked the story, I will say that. It amped up the big hitting moments from the previous games and presented them better as well, at least in my opinion. Giving us the background of Junior, Momo's origins, absolving the late Joachim Mizrahi, there was plenty to get the teeth into for this one. And then of course setting up the final game with the disappearance of the Zohar, along with Dmitry Yuriev and the ever-present threat of Udu as well. Narratively, episode 2 was good. Flawed for sure, but enjoyable in parts. Now before we do move to episode 3, I'm going to give a brief mention to a game made in between these two mainline entries called Xenosaga Pike Piper. It was Japan only and released in 2004 initially and later 2006 for mobile devices. Sadly, we never got to see this, and it had some pretty important lore tied to it as well, as this one focused on the origins of Ziggy 100 years prior to the first game. Apparently this storyline in of itself was conceived at an early stage of development, but was given to Namco's mobile department when they approached Monolith Soft. I still don't really see the logic here, considering it's a notable part of the overall Xenosaga mythos, but maybe Monolith Soft felt that they just didn't have the time nor budget to incorporate it in one more game, considering as well that it was initially meant to be part of episode 2. The best version we have at present is a fan-translated video walkthrough, which will naturally be linked for your pleasure if you want to check it out. Thank you for watching this video. If you liked it, please like and subscribe for more JRPG content, and consider joining my Patreon if you're interested. Peace.